Buried in the Wilkinson County Courthouse, records mention a plantation that operated under a system so disturbing that after the Civil War, local officials tried to erase its very existence from public documents. Between 1835 and 1858, for 23 years, the Jessup family plantation operated what neighboring landowners would privately call the breeding operation. This was a systematic program where the plantation owner, his wife, and all 5 of their children willingly participated in forced reproduction with enslaved people, all to maximize profit and secure generational wealth. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the events themselves, but how methodically everything was planned, how willingly the entire family took part, and how completely the surrounding community decided to look away. Discovered in a locked trunk in 1962, the Jessup ledgers documented everything with the cold precision of livestock records, except these entries were human beings. Before we continue with the story of the Jessup plantation and how an entire family convinced themselves that breeding human beings like cattle was simply good business, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And please, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're watching from. Now, let's go back to 1835, to Mississippi, to understand how this horror began. Wilkinson County, Mississippi in 1835 was cotton country, where with each harvest, fortunes rose and fell. About 8 miles northeast of Woodville, the county seat, the Jessup plantation sat on 200 acres of rich Delta soil. Wee's inheritance money from his father, a Virginia tobacco merchant who had made considerable profit supplying Confederate forces during various conflicts, Isaiah Jessup had purchased the land in 1829. When he bought the property, Isaiah was 31 years old, newly married to Ruth Cavendish, the daughter of a South Carolina plantation owner. Ruth was 23, educated in Charleston, and from a family that for 3 generations had operated a large rice plantation. Primarily, the Jessup plantation grew cotton, but it also maintained vegetable gardens, a small orchard, and livestock. By 1835, Isaiah owned 42 enslaved people, a modest number compared to the area's largest plantations, but substantial enough to mark him as a man of means. A 2-story structure with white columns built in the Greek Revival style popular among wealthy Southerners of that era served as the plantation house. Upstairs were 6 bedrooms, along with a large dining room, a study for Isaiah, and a parlor where Ruth entertained the wives of other plantation owners. Isaiah and Ruth had married in 1830, and in 1831, their first child, Thomas, was born. Then came Samuel in 1833, Margaret in 1835, Daniel in 1837, and finally, in 1839, Elizabeth. 5 children in 8 years. With the help of enslaved domestic workers, Ruth managed the household, while Isaiah spent his days overseeing the fields, traveling to Natchez to conduct business, and maintaining relationships with cotton brokers and other plantation owners. To any outside observer, the Jessups appeared to be a typical wealthy plantation family of the antebellum South. Every Sunday, they attended church at the Woodville Presbyterian congregation. Isaiah served on the county agricultural board. Ruth participated in ladies' charitable societies. A private tutor, a man named Charles Whitfield from Kentucky who lived in a cottage on the property, educated their children, teaching the Jessup children reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. But behind closed doors, inside the plantation house, Isaiah and Ruth were having conversations that would have shocked even the hardened sensibilities of their slave-owning neighbors. Isaiah had become obsessed with a particular problem that plagued many plantation owners, the constant need to purchase new enslaved workers. Throughout the 1830s, prices had been climbing steadily. A significant investment, a healthy adult male field worker could cost anywhere from $800 to $1,200. When enslaved people became too old to work, or died from disease or injury, that investment was lost. In his study, Isaiah spent hours poring over his account books, calculating expenses and projecting future costs. Having grown up watching her father manage a large plantation, Ruth understood the economics of slavery as well as any man. Her father had always maintained that the most profitable plantations were those that could grow their own workforce, meaning they encouraged reproduction among enslaved people to create new workers without the expense of purchase. This was common practice throughout the South, but the Cavendish plantation had taken it further. Ruth's father had systematically paired enslaved people he considered strong or healthy, sometimes separating families to create what he believed would be optimal breeding pairs. These ideas Ruth brought to her marriage, but Isaiah wanted to go further. During the winter of 1834, when Ruth was pregnant with Margaret, Isaiah proposed something to his wife that would shape the next 2 decades of their lives and the lives of everyone on their plantation. He suggested that instead of merely encouraging reproduction among enslaved people, they should directly participate in it themselves. His reasoning, as he explained it to Ruth, was purely economic. By law, the children born from such unions would be enslaved, following the condition of the mother, but they would carry Jessup blood, which Isaiah believed would make them stronger, healthier, and more valuable. These children could be kept to work the plantation or sold at premium prices. Either way, it would be, in his words, investing in our future prosperity. Ruth did not reject the idea immediately. For several weeks, she thought about it. She prayed about it, she later told her children. She consulted the account books. She remembered her father's methods. And eventually, she agreed. But she added one condition. Their children would be raised knowing this was their duty, their contribution to family prosperity. When the time came, all of them would participate. As a unit, the family would operate, maximizing production and ensuring the plantation's success for generations. Though the results would be horrific, this was not a decision born from sadism or perversion. This was calculated, methodical economic planning, dressed up as family duty, and once Ruth agreed, they began preparing their children for what would be expected of them. When his parents began his education, Thomas Jessup was only 3 years old. He could not have understood the full implications of what he was being taught, but the lessons started early. At the dinner table, Isaiah and Ruth spoke openly about the enslaved people on the plantation as property, as investments, as breeding stock. They used the same language they used when discussing horses or cattle. From his earliest memories, Thomas heard this language. It became normal to him. By 1839, when Thomas was 8 years old, he understood what would be expected of him when he came of age. His father explained it during one of their walks around the plantation. Thomas would help grow the workforce. It was a son's duty to contribute to family prosperity. As responsibility, as maturity, as the mark of a man ready to take his place in managing the family enterprise, Isaiah framed it. Samuel received the same education. So did Daniel. Differently, the girls Margaret and Elizabeth were taught, but with the same end goal. Ruth explained to them that bearing children was a woman's purpose and that bearing children who would increase family wealth was the highest purpose of all. She taught them that enslaved women were beneath them in all ways and that using them for family benefit was no different than using them to cook meals or wash clothes. They were tools, resources. Aiselatid, the children grew up. Outside the family, they had few friends. Their tutor Charles Whitfield taught them reading and mathematics, but the truly formative education came from their parents. By 1845, Thomas was 14, Samuel was 12, Margaret was 10, Daniel was 8, and Elizabeth was 6. On a strict schedule, the household operated. Meals at the same time every day, church on Sundays, work during the week. Isaiah increasingly involved Thomas in plantation management, teaching him to inspect the fields, to evaluate the health and productivity of enslaved workers, to think always in terms of profit and loss. Because they knew nothing else, the Jessup children did not question what they were taught. They had no outside perspective, no contrary voice. Their tutor never challenged Isaiah's authority. The Presbyterian minister who visited the plantation saw only a prosperous, well-ordered household. Other plantation families who interacted with the Jessups noticed nothing unusual. Or if they did, they said nothing. The culture of the antebellum South was one of privacy regarding what happened on a man's own property. What the plantation owner did with his enslaved people was his business. On a humid evening in May of 1848, when Thomas turned 17, after dinner, Isaiah called him into the study. Ruth was there, sitting in the corner chair. Thomas sat across from his father's desk. Isaiah explained that Thomas was now a man, and it was time for him to fulfill his duty to the family. A young woman named Hannah, who was 20 years old and worked in the kitchen, had been selected. That night, she would be brought to Thomas's room. Thomas did not refuse. His entire life, he had been prepared for this moment. It was expected. It was duty. That night marked the beginning of the systematic breeding program that would define the Jessup plantation for the next decade. Within 3 months, Hannah became pregnant. In May of 1849, she gave birth to a boy. With satisfaction, Isaiah recorded the birth in his ledger. He named the child Isaac, wrote property of Jessup plantation next to the entry, and estimated the child's future value at maturity. Within those weeks of giving birth, Hannah was returned to kitchen work. An older enslaved woman named Claudia, who had raised many of the enslaved children on the plantation, cared for the baby. Thomas continued his duties. Over the next 3 years, with 3 different enslaved women, he fathered 4 more children. When he turned 17, Samuel began his participation in 1850. Daniel began in 1854. The daughters Margaret and Elizabeth were expected to bear children as well. But in their case, the father would be enslaved men selected by Isaiah for what he considered desirable physical characteristics: strength, health, good teeth, clear eyes. Margaret turned 18 pulgadas 1853. For months, Ruth spent preparing her psychologically for what was coming. Margaret did not resist. Her whole life, she had been taught that this was normal, expected, righteous even. On a Saturday night in November, an enslaved man named Jacob, who was 25 years old and worked as a blacksmith on the plantation, was brought to Margaret's room. Margaret became pregnant. In August of 1854, she gave birth to a daughter. Ruth insisted that Margaret continue her participation. Over the next 4 years, Margaret had 3 more children. When she turned 18 pulgadas 1857, Elizabeth followed the same pattern. By that point, the system was well established. With cold efficiency, the family operated. Isaiah maintained meticulous records. Ruth managed the household and supervised the pregnancies and births. The sons performed their assigned duties. The daughters bore children. The enslaved people had no voice, no choice, no escape. What made the Jessup operation particularly disturbing was not just the forced reproduction, but the systematic nature of it. Like agriculture, Isaiah treated it. It rotated which enslaved women were paired with his sons to avoid what he called overuse of any individual. It tracked menstrual cycles. Not out of compassion, but to ensure healthy births, he provided better food rations to pregnant women. It separated mothers from children at age 3, believing that early separation prevented emotional bonds that might interfere with productivity. The plantation ledgers from this period, which survived and were eventually discovered, are chilling in their detail. Each birth is recorded with the mother's name, the date, the child's sex, any notable physical characteristics, and an estimated future value. The children fathered by Isaiah himself, and he did participate beginning in 1850 when Thomas had proven the viability of the system, are marked with a small notation in the margin, J direct line. These children, Isaiah believed, would command the highest prices if sold or would be the most productive if kept. By 1855, the plantation population had grown from 42 to 68. 26 of those were children under the age of 10, all born as part of the breeding program. Substantially, the Jessup family wealth increased. Isaiah expanded his land holdings, purchasing an adjacent 300 acres. He built a new barn, a cotton gin building, and additional slave quarters to house the growing population. It was considered one of the most successful planters in Wilkinson County. A brutal rhythm, life on the Jessup plantation followed. Before dawn, the field workers rose, worked until dark, and returned to their cabins exhausted. The house servants worked slightly shorter hours, but were under constant supervision. By age 5, children born into slavery on the plantation were put to light work, carrying water, picking vegetables, running errands. By age 10, they were in the fields or learning trades. The family grew, but families were not allowed to truly form. Isaiah's policy of early separation meant that mothers and children spent only the first 3 years together, and even during that time, the mothers were working. The older woman, Claudia, who cared for the youngest children, did her best to provide some maternal comfort, but she was managing a dozen infants and toddlers at any given time. Though their suffering was not recorded in Isaiah's ledgers, the psychological impact on the enslaved people was profound. They lived in constant fear, constant vigilance, knowing that any woman of childbearing age could be selected, that any child born would be taken, that resistance meant punishment or death. Some tried to resist. In 1851, after being forced to bear her third child, fathered by Samuel Jessup, a woman named Sarah attempted to run away. She made it 17 miles before being captured by a slave patrol. She was returned to the plantation, whipped publicly as punishment, and locked in a small storage shed for those weeks with minimal food and water. When she was released, she no longer spoke. She worked silently for the rest of her life, died of pneumonia in 1863, and was buried in the unmarked section of the plantation cemetery. All participated in the system their parents created, the Jessup children, Thomas, Samuel, Margaret, Daniel, and Elizabeth, but they were not identical in their responses. Thomas, the oldest, seemed to accept his role with little visible emotional conflict. He managed sections of the plantation, oversaw field work, conducted business in town, and as directed, fathered children with enslaved women. In 1853, he married a woman named Virginia Gentry from a neighboring plantation. But this did not change his participation in the breeding program. Virginia either did not know the full extent of what occurred on the Jessup plantation, or she chose not to acknowledge it. As early as 1852, Samuel, the second son, showed signs of distress. He began drinking heavily, often disappearing for days at a time. Isaiah punished him for neglecting duties, but Samuel's drinking only worsened. By 1855, he was functional, but clearly miserable, speaking little, avoiding eye contact with both family and enslaved people. He never married. He continued his participation in the breeding program until 1858, but with increasingly erratic behavior. After the birth of her fourth child in 1857, Margaret began experiencing what Ruth described in letters to her sister as melancholic episodes. For days, Margaret would lock herself in her room, refusing meals, speaking to no one. Ruth treated this as a temporary weakness that required discipline, not sympathy. Margaret was not permitted to stop her participation. She had a fifth child in 1859, shortly before the breeding program began to collapse. Daniel and Elizabeth, the youngest, had grown up so thoroughly immersed in the system that they seemed to view it as completely normal. They participated without visible hesitation when their time came. This total acceptance might have been the most disturbing aspect of all, demonstrating how completely a person could be shaped by their environment, how thoroughly an evil practice could be normalized, but cracks were beginning to show. For the existing infrastructure, the enslaved population of the plantation had grown too large. Housing was crowded. Food rations, though adequate by the standards of the time, were stretched thin. More significantly, the children fathered by the Jessup family were becoming old enough to understand their parentage. By 1857, some of these children were 8 or 9 years old enough to wonder why they looked different from other enslaved children, why they had lighter skin or different hair texture. The older enslaved people on the plantation told them the truth quietly in the privacy of the quarters after dark. This created an atmosphere of resentment and tension that even Isaiah's strict discipline could not completely suppress. The enslaved people knew which children belonged to which family member. They knew the system. They hated it. But they were powerless to stop it. And any organized resistance would result in brutal punishment or sale to plantations further south, where conditions were even worse. Neighboring plantation owners began to notice things. Unusually quickly, the Jessup plantation population had grown. The demographics were odd. Though many young children in proportion to adults. Among plantation wives, a few whispered conversations occurred about Ruth Jessup's daughters and their unexplained pregnancies before marriage. But this was the antebellum South, where social cohesion among the white planter class was maintained by silence on uncomfortable topics. As long as the Jessops conducted themselves appropriately in public, which they did, no one would confront them directly. Isaiah himself seemed immune to any moral qualms. His letters from this period, some of which survived in family collections, discussed plantation management with other owners, cotton prices, political developments, and various business matters. He mentions the success of his breeding program in economic terms only, comparing his results to those achieved with livestock breeding. There is no indication of guilt, no moment of doubt, no recognition that he was committing profound evil. He had created a mental framework in which enslaved people were not fully human. And within that framework, his actions were logical, even commendable. It was being a good steward of his resources. It was building generational wealth for his family. Ruth's perspective, glimpsed through occasional letters she wrote to her sister in South Carolina, was similar. She worried about her children's health and futures. But these worries were purely practical. Whether Thomas would successfully inherit the plantation, whether Samuel's drinking would become a serious problem, whether the daughters would eventually marry well. Despite their participation in the breeding program, she never expressed concern for the enslaved women who were being raped or the children being born into bondage or the psychological damage being done to everyone involved. In her worldview, enslaved people were property, tools, and their suffering was irrelevant. The absolute moral blindness of the Jessup family was not unique to them. Thousands of plantation owners throughout the South operated under similar assumptions. What made the Jessups unusual was the systematic involvement of the entire family, the multi-generational planning, the cold calculation. Most forced reproduction on plantations was opportunistic, driven by individual owners, exploitation of enslaved women. The Jessup program was different. It was organized, methodical, a family business. The year 1858 brought changes that would begin to unravel the system Isaiah and Ruth had built. In February, Charles Whitfield, the tutor who had educated the Jessup children for more than 2 decades, died suddenly of a heart condition. He was 57 years old. His death meant the family lost someone who, through his silence, had enabled their operation. Whitfield had known. He had lived on the plantation for years, had seen the pattern, had observed the growing number of mixed-race children. He had never said anything to anyone outside the plantation. His complicity through silence was as damaging as active participation. After Whitfield's death, Isaiah decided the younger children no longer needed formal tutoring. Elizabeth, at 19, was considered educated enough. Daniel, at 21, was already managing significant portions of the plantation. The family could operate without an outsider living on the property. This decision increased their isolation even further. In April, an enslaved woman named Rose, who was 32 years old and had borne 5 children as part of the breeding program, fell severely ill with what was probably tuberculosis, though it was not diagnosed as such at the time. She coughed blood, ran high fevers, lost weight rapidly. Ruth, concerned about the potential for disease to spread through the enslaved population, ordered Rose isolated in a small cabin at the far edge of the quarters. Alone, separated from her children, Rose died 3 weeks later. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave. Rose's death affected the enslaved community deeply. She had been well-liked, had quietly provided comfort to other women forced into the breeding program, had sung hymns in the evenings that could be heard across the quarters. Her death and burial, rushed, unmarked, with no ceremony, was seen as an indication of her worthlessness in the eyes of the Jessup family. Anger simmered. That summer, the cotton crop suffered from boll weevil infestation, reducing yield significantly. Isaiah's income dropped. He needed to sell some of the enslaved children who were now old enough to work to raise cash. In August, he sold 6 children, ranging in age from 8 to 12, to a slave trader who transported them to Louisiana. 4 of those children had been fathered by his sons. Without ceremony, he separated them from their mothers, loading them into a wagon early one morning and sending them away. The mothers were not permitted to say goodbye. This event broke something in the enslaved community. The passive acceptance that had characterized the previous decade gave way to quiet rage. The enslaved people began talking among themselves about the possibility of escape, about the rumors they had heard of the Underground Railroad, about the increasing tensions between North and South over slavery. So many of the younger men talked about violence, about rebellion, though the older people cautioned against it. The memory of the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831 and its brutal suppression was still fresh in Southern collective memory. Open rebellion meant death. Samuel Jessup's drinking reached a crisis point in September. He was found unconscious in the barn one afternoon, having consumed most of a bottle of whiskey. Isaiah had him carried to the house, berated him when he regained consciousness, and threatened to disinherit him if the behavior continued. Samuel promised to reform, but the promise was empty. His nightly drinking continued. He began to neglect plantation duties entirely. Thomas had to take over Samuel's responsibilities. Margaret's mental state also deteriorated. In October, after the birth of her fifth child, a son she was not permitted to keep, who was taken from her after 3 days and given to Claudia to raise, Margaret attempted to harm herself. The specific method was never recorded, but Ruth's letter to her sister mentioned that Margaret had been prevented from a rash action and was being closely supervised. For 3 weeks, Margaret was confined to her room under Ruth's watch. When she emerged, she was pale, thin, and hollow-eyed. She spoke only when directly addressed. She moved through the house like a ghost. The emotional and psychological strain on the Jessup family was becoming visible, but they could not or would not acknowledge its source. Isaiah attributed Samuel's drinking to weakness of character. Ruth attributed Margaret's depression to female hysteria. Neither connected their children's suffering to the monstrous system they had created and enforced. The fundamental premise that enslaved people were property and could be used however the family saw fit remained unquestioned. In November, a traveling Methodist minister stayed overnight at the plantation while passing through the county. His name was Reverend William Foster, and he was from Pennsylvania, traveling through the South to observe conditions and report back to his congregation. He ate dinner with the family, said Grace, engaged in polite conversation, but he noticed things. He observed the unusual number of young children in the slave quarters. Noted the physical similarities between some of those children and the Jessup family. Saw the haunted look in Margaret's eyes and the drunken glaze in Samuel's. Reverend Foster did not confront the family directly. That would have been socially impossible and potentially dangerous. But after he left the plantation the next morning, he made notes in a journal he kept. Those notes survive. They describe his suspicions about what was occurring on the Jessup plantation, his horror at the implications, and his sense of helplessness. What could he do? He was a northerner with no authority in Mississippi. Slavery itself was legal. Even if he reported his suspicions to local authorities, they would do nothing. Plantation owners had almost absolute control over their enslaved people. As long as they did not murder them outright, and even that was rarely prosecuted, they faced no consequences. Reverend Foster's account, published years later in a collection of testimonies about slavery, is one of the few external confirmations that something deeply disturbing was happening on the Jessup plantation in the 1850s. It described the atmosphere as oppressive beyond the usual oppression of slavery and noted that the enslaved people I observed seemed to live in a state of terror that went beyond normal fear of punishment. December brought cold weather and the end of the cotton harvest. The reduced yield meant financial pressure on Isaiah. He spent long hours in his study reviewing accounts, calculating how to maintain profitability. His solution was to intensify the breeding program further. He instructed Thomas and Daniel to increase their participation. He selected 3 additional enslaved women he considered suitable. He set targets, a specific number of births he wanted to achieve in the coming year. On Christmas Day, the Jessup family attended church in Woodville, as they did every Sunday and major holiday. They sat in their usual pew, sang hymns, listened to the sermon. The minister, Reverend Donald Patterson, spoke about duty, family, and Christian virtue. The Jessups nodded in agreement. After the service, they socialized with other plantation families on the church lawn. Ruth discussed recipes and household management with other women.